Most of what you think you know about the Crusades is wrong. And I don't mean slightly off. I mean fundamentally, structurally, embarrassingly wrong. The version of the Crusades that most people carry around in their heads, the one they picked up in school or from a documentary or from a politician's speech, goes something like this. A bunch of greedy, bloodthirsty European knights, whipped into a frenzy by a power-hungry pope, launched an unprovoked war of aggression against the peaceful and sophisticated Muslim world. They slaughtered their way across the Middle East, stole land, exploited people, and set the stage for centuries of resentment that echo all the way to the present day. It is a neat story. It is also, in almost every important respect, a distortion. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. The Crusades were brutal. They involved massacres, betrayals, unforgivable atrocities against innocent people, including fellow Christians and Jewish communities, who had nothing to do with the conflict. None of what I am about to tell you is an attempt to whitewash that violence or pretend it didn't happen. What I am going to do is take you through the actual sequence of events, the actual motivations, the actual geopolitical pressures that created the Crusades. Because when you strip away the mythology and look at the raw history, what you find is far more complicated, far more interesting, and far more relevant to the world we live in today than the simplified version that most people have been taught. So let's start at the beginning, and I don't mean 1095. The year that Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont. I mean the real beginning, because to understand why the Crusades happened, you have to go back roughly 450 years before a single European knight ever set foot in the Holy Land. In the early 7th century, the Middle East, North Africa, and much of the Mediterranean world were overwhelmingly Christian. Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, North Africa, these were the heartlands of Christianity. They had been Christian for centuries. The great theological debates, the church councils, the earliest monasteries, the communities that produced some of the most important figures in Christian history, all of that emerged from this region. Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, these were not peripheral outposts, they were the core. And then, beginning in the 630s, everything changed. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Arab armies surged outward from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and a ferocity that stunned the known world. Within a single decade, they had conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire and had ripped enormous chunks of territory away from the Byzantine Empire, which was the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire and, at that time, the most powerful Christian state on earth. Damascus fell in 635. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity, fell in 638. Alexandria, the intellectual jewel of the ancient Mediterranean, fell in 642. By the end of the 7th century, Muslim armies had swept across all of North Africa, territories that had been Roman, then Christian, for over half a millennium. Now, I want to pause here and emphasize something. The lands that Muslim armies conquered were not empty. They were not unclaimed wilderness. They were deeply established Christian civilizations with centuries of history, infrastructure, theology, and culture. The people living there did not invite conquest. They were overrun by a military force that was, at that moment in history, essentially unstoppable. And the expansion did not stop at North Africa. In 711, Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and invaded the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal. Within just a few years, almost the entire peninsula was under Islamic control. The Visigothic Christian kingdom that had ruled there for centuries was effectively destroyed. Muslim armies then pushed across the Pyrenees into what is now France. It was not until 732, at the Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers, that the Frankish leader Charles Martel managed to halt their advance into Western Europe. Many historians regard this as one of the most consequential battles in European history. Had the Franks lost, the entire trajectory of Western civilization could have been radically different. Now think about this timeline for a moment. By the early 8th century, roughly 100 years after the initial Arab conquests, approximately 2/3 of the formerly Christian world had been conquered by Muslim armies. 2/3. The entire southern and eastern rim of the Mediterranean, lands that had been Christian for as long as Christianity had existed as a religion, were now under Islamic rule. The Byzantine Empire, which had once stretched from southern Spain to Mesopotamia, was reduced to a rump state clinging to Asia Minor and parts of Greece, and the pressure never really let up. Muslim fleets attacked Constantinople itself multiple times. Muslim raiders sacked parts of southern Italy. They seized Sicily. They captured Crete and other Mediterranean islands. For centuries, the Christian world was on the defensive, losing ground decade after decade, generation after generation. And yet, somehow, in the popular telling of history, none of this is the beginning of the story. The story always seems to begin in 1095, as though the Crusades erupted out of nowhere, an act of random European aggression against a world that was minding its own business. But that framing only works if you erase the preceding 4.5 centuries of military conquest. And erasing 4.5 centuries of context is not history, it is propaganda. So what finally triggered the Crusades? What was the specific event that pushed Western Christendom to respond after centuries of absorbing blow after blow? The answer lies in one of the most catastrophic military defeats in medieval history, a battle that most people have never heard of, and yet it changed the course of civilization. On August the 26th, 1071, at a place called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, near what is now the city of Malazgirt in modern Turkey, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a massive army against the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a relatively new power. They were Turkic nomads from Central Asia who had converted to Islam and had been steadily expanding westward, carving out an empire that stretched from Persia into the heart of the Middle East. Their sultan, Alp Arslan, was a brilliant military commander, and his forces were disciplined, fast, and devastatingly effective. The Byzantine army, on the other hand, was a mess. It was a patchwork force of native Byzantine troops, Frankish mercenaries, Norman adventurers, and various other contingents that had little loyalty to one another. Internal political rivalries had weakened the empire's military readiness, and at Manzikert, those fractures proved fatal. At a critical moment during the battle, a general named Andronikos Doukas, who had political ambitions of his own, deliberately withdrew his forces from the field. Some of the Turkish mercenaries fighting for the Byzantines switched sides and joined their Seljuk relatives. The Byzantine formation collapsed. Emperor Romanos himself was captured on the battlefield, something that had not happened to a Roman or Byzantine emperor in centuries. It was a humiliation of almost unimaginable proportions. Now, the battle itself was not a total annihilation. Byzantine casualties, while significant, were not catastrophic in purely military terms, but the political and psychological aftermath was devastating. When Romanos was eventually released by the Seljuks, he returned to Constantinople only to be overthrown by his political rivals. He was blinded and imprisoned, and he died shortly after from his injuries. The empire plunged into a period of civil war and political chaos, and while the Byzantines were busy tearing themselves apart, the Seljuk Turks poured into Anatolia virtually unopposed. Within a decade, the Seljuks had conquered nearly all of Asia Minor. They established what became known as the Sultanate of Rum, with its capital at Nicaea, just across the water from Constantinople itself. They captured Edessa in 1078. They took Antioch, one of the most important cities in Christian history. And in 1087, they seized Jerusalem from their rival Muslims, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. Now, this is where the story gets particularly important, because the seizure of Jerusalem by the Seljuk Turks changed the situation on the ground in ways that directly led to the Crusades. Under the Fatimid Caliphate, Christian pilgrims had generally been allowed to visit the Holy Land with relative, though not always consistent, safety. The Fatimids were a Shia dynasty, and while there had been occasional periods of persecution, most notably the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim in 1009, the general policy was one of tolerance, at least by medieval standards. The Fatimids profited from the pilgrim trade, and they had no particular reason to stop it. The Seljuk Turks were different. They were Sunni, they were aggressive, and they were in the midst of an expansionary military campaign. Reports began filtering back to Europe of Christian pilgrims being robbed, beaten, enslaved, and killed. Some of these reports were undoubtedly exaggerated. Medieval accounts were not known for their restraint, but the underlying reality was clear enough. The roads to Jerusalem were no longer safe for Christian travelers, and the Byzantine Empire, which had for centuries served as a buffer between the Muslim world and Western Europe, was on the verge of total collapse. It was in this context that the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos made a fateful decision. In March of 1095, he sent ambassadors to Pope Urban II with an urgent request for military assistance. Alexios was a shrewd and pragmatic ruler. He had managed to stabilize the Byzantine Empire after the chaos that followed Manzikert, but he knew he did not have the manpower to retake Anatolia on his own. He needed Western mercenaries, experienced soldiers who could help him push the Seljuks back. What he got was something he never anticipated and something far bigger than he ever imagined. Pope Urban II was himself a remarkable figure. He was born into a noble family in northern France, had been educated at the cathedral school in Reims, and had served as a prior at the powerful monastery of Cluny before rising through the ranks of the church. By 1088, when he became pope, he was already known as a reformer and a skilled political operator. But he was also dealing with enormous challenges. The investiture controversy, a bitter power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the right to appoint bishops, had divided Western Christendom and weakened papal authority. Urban needed something big, something that would unite the fractious nobles of Europe under the banner of the Church and reassert the Pope's position as the spiritual leader of the entire Christian world. And then Alexios's plea for help landed on his desk. Urban saw an opportunity that was bigger than sending a few thousand mercenaries to Constantinople. He saw the chance to mobilize all of Christendom in a holy cause, to redirect the violent energy of Europe's warrior class away from internal conflicts and toward an external enemy, to reunify the eastern and western branches of Christianity, which had been drifting apart for decades, and to establish the papacy as the supreme moral authority in the West. On November the 27th, 1095, at the Council of Clermont in central France, Urban delivered what has been called the most effective single speech in European history. The exact words of the speech have not survived. No official transcript was kept, but we have at least 5 different accounts written by people who were present, and while they differ in details, they converge on the central themes. Urban described the suffering of Eastern Christians at the hands of the Turks. He spoke of the desecration of holy places. He called upon the knights and warriors of Europe to take up the cross and march to the defense of their fellow Christians and the liberation of Jerusalem. And then he made a promise that electrified his audience. Anyone who participated in this holy expedition would receive a full remission of their sins. In a world where people genuinely, deeply, viscerally believed in heaven and hell, where eternal damnation was not a metaphor but a terrifying certainty, this was an offer that was almost impossible to refuse. The crowd erupted. The famous cry that rang out across the field at Clermont was, Deus vult, God wills it. Thousands of men pledged on the spot to take the cross. Within weeks, the message had spread across France, Germany, England, Italy, and beyond. Europe was going to war. Now here is where we need to talk about what historians often get wrong, or at least what they oversimplify. The standard narrative presents the motivations of the Crusaders in one of 2 ways, depending on the historian's ideological bent. The first version says, the Crusaders were driven purely by religious fanaticism, mindless zealots who marched east because the Pope told them to. The second version says they were driven purely by greed, that the talk of piety was just a cover for land-grabbing, profit-seeking, and colonial exploitation. Both of these are reductions. The reality was vastly more complicated. Let's start with the religious motivation, because dismissing it as fanaticism misses something fundamental about the medieval world. In the 11th century, Christianity was not a Sunday hobby. It was the organizing principle of society. It shaped law, politics, art, medicine, education, warfare, everything. The concept of sin was not abstract. People believed with absolute certainty that their actions in this life determined their fate for eternity. A knight who had spent his career killing people, even in legitimate warfare, carried a genuine burden of guilt. The church's penitential system was designed to address that guilt, but the penances were often severe. Pilgrimages were one of the most common forms of penance, and the most significant pilgrimage a Christian could make was to Jerusalem, to walk where Christ walked, to pray at the Holy Sepulchre. When Urban offered the crusade as a form of penance, he was offering something genuinely revolutionary. He was telling warriors that the very thing they did best, fighting, could itself become an act of spiritual purification. Instead of going on a long, expensive, and dangerous pilgrimage as a passive penitent, they could fight their way to Jerusalem and earn salvation through combat. For men who had spent their lives worried about the state of their souls, this was transformative. It did not mean they were mindless. It meant they were deeply devout in a way that is difficult for modern, secular people to fully comprehend. But here's the thing. Genuine religious motivation does not preclude other motivations from operating at the same time. And this is where the economic and social pressures come in. By the late 11th century, Western Europe was experiencing significant demographic and economic strain. The population had been growing steadily for several generations, putting pressure on a finite supply of arable land. The feudal system of inheritance, particularly the practice of primogeniture, concentrated wealth and property in the hands of eldest sons. Younger sons of noble families, and there were a lot of them, found themselves with titles but no land, with military training but no armies, with ambitions but no prospects. They were a volatile class, heavily armed, frequently violent, and increasingly desperate for opportunities. The Crusades offered them a way out. The Pope had promised that Crusaders could keep any territory they won. For a younger son with no inheritance, the prospect of carving out a domain in the rich lands of the East was enormously attractive. This was not colonialism in the modern sense, as the historian Thomas Madden has pointed out. There was no mother country directing the expansion. There was no colonial government linked to a home government. There was no policy of economic exploitation. But it was, undeniably, a chance for dispossessed men to acquire land and status in a way that was simply not available to them in Europe. And it was not just younger sons. Western Europe, in the decade before the Crusades, was ravaged by famine and disease. Between 1086 and 1095, agricultural failures caused widespread suffering. People were starving. Entire communities were devastated. The dying went unattended and the dead went unburied. In that kind of environment, the promise of a new life in a distant land, combined with the guarantee of divine forgiveness, was an almost irresistible combination of spiritual hope and material desperation. There were also deeply cynical motivations at work. Italian merchant cities, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, saw the Crusades as an opportunity to expand their trading networks into the eastern Mediterranean. They provided ships, supplies, and financing in exchange for commercial privileges in the ports of the Crusader states. The Normans of southern Italy, who had already conquered Sicily from the Muslims and had been raiding Byzantine territory for decades, saw the Crusades as an extension of their existing expansionist agenda. And the papacy itself had political motivations that went far beyond the spiritual. By directing the military energy of Europe outward, Urban could reduce the internal warfare that was tearing the continent apart. By positioning himself as the leader of a pan-European military campaign, he could assert papal authority over secular rulers in a way that no amount of theological argument could achieve. So the motivations were layered. They were religious, economic, social, political, and personal, all at the same time. And they operated differently for different people. A French baron with 5 sons and limited land had different motivations than a Venetian merchant. A devout peasant who genuinely believed he was serving God had different motivations than a Norman adventurer looking for a fight and a fortune. Reducing all of these people to a single category, whether that category is fanatics or imperialists, is not just inaccurate. It is lazy history. Now, the story of what actually happened when the crusade got underway is itself a study in chaos, heroism, and horror. The first wave to set out was not the organized military force that Urban had envisioned. It was a ragged, uncontrolled mass of peasants, minor nobles, and assorted followers, led by a charismatic French preacher named Peter the Hermit. This movement, which historians call the People's Crusade, departed in the spring of 1096, months before the main armies were supposed to leave. Peter's followers were poorly armed, poorly organized, and poorly led. They had almost no understanding of the geography they were traversing, or the enemy they were going to face. And before they even left Europe, they committed one of the most shameful atrocities of the entire crusading era. As the crusading fervor swept through France and Germany, some of these groups turned their violence not against the distant Muslims, but against the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. In cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, crusader bands led by figures like Count Emicho of Flonheim massacred Jewish men, women, and children. The logic, if you can call it that, was grotesquely simple. Why travel thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ when the enemies of Christ were right here? The Bishop of Speyer tried to protect the local Jews, but he could only save some of them. In Mainz, the Jewish community sought refuge with the local archbishop, but the Crusaders overwhelmed his defenses. Estimates of the dead range from 2,000 to as many as 12,000. It was the worst outbreak of anti-Jewish violence in Europe up to that point, and it established a terrible precedent that would be repeated in subsequent crusades. It is important to note that Pope Urban had not called for violence against Jews. The official church position condemned these attacks. But the crusading message, once unleashed, proved impossible to control. The religious energy that Urban had tried to channel toward a specific military objective instead diffused into a broader wave of violence against anyone perceived as an enemy of the faith. It is one of the most disturbing lessons of the Crusades, and one that remains relevant. When you weaponize religious fervor, you cannot always control where the weapon is aimed. The People's Crusade itself came to a predictably disastrous end. After stumbling through Hungary and the Balkans, where they clashed with local populations and Byzantine forces, the survivors reached Constantinople. Emperor Alexios, horrified by this undisciplined mob, ferried them across the Bosporus as quickly as possible to get them out of his city. In Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks annihilated them. Peter the Hermit survived because he had gone back to Constantinople before the final battle, but the vast majority of his followers were killed or enslaved. The People's Crusade was over before it had really begun. The actual military crusade, the one led by the princes and barons of Europe, was a very different affair. It was organized, well-funded, and led by experienced military commanders. Among the most prominent were Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest nobles in France, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer with a sharp mind and a sharper sword, and Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France. These men and their armies converged on Constantinople between late 1096 and early 1097. Emperor Alexios was initially relieved. This was closer to the kind of military help he had requested. But he was also deeply suspicious. He made each of the Crusader leaders swear an oath of loyalty to him, promising to return to the empire any formerly Byzantine territory they might conquer. Some swore willingly. Others, like Bohemond, swore with obvious reluctance and even more obvious insincerity. The Crusaders crossed into Anatolia in the spring of 1097 and almost immediately won a significant victory. They besieged and captured Nicaea, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, and returned it to Byzantine control, much to Alexios' satisfaction. Then they marched deeper into Anatolia, and in July of that year they fought and won the Battle of Dorylaeum, a brutal encounter that shattered the Seljuk field army and opened the road to the south. What followed was one of the most grueling military marches in history. The Crusaders crossed the Anatolian plateau in the heat of summer with inadequate water and supplies. Horses died by the thousands. Men collapsed from heat and thirst. But they kept going. In October of 1097, they reached Antioch, one of the greatest cities in the eastern Mediterranean, and laid siege to it. The siege of Antioch lasted nearly 8 months. It was a nightmare of starvation, disease, and intermittent combat. The Crusaders themselves were besieged by a Muslim relief army while they were besieging the city. At one point, the situation was so desperate that Crusaders were reportedly eating horses, dogs, and even less mentionable things. But through a combination of treachery, when a guard inside the city was bribed to open a gate, and sheer determination, the Crusaders finally captured Antioch in June of 1098. They then turned and defeated the Muslim relief army in a battle outside the city walls, a victory that many Crusaders attributed to divine intervention. Bohemond of Taranto claimed Antioch for himself, violating his oath to Alexios and setting up one of the first Crusader states. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define the entire crusading era. Western knights carving out their own domains in the east, sometimes in cooperation with the Byzantines, more often in competition with them. The remaining Crusaders continued south toward Jerusalem. They arrived at the city's walls in June of 1099. By this time, the Fatimid Caliphate had recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks, and the city was garrisoned by Fatimid troops. The Crusaders, now reduced to perhaps 12,000 to 13,000 soldiers from the tens of thousands who had set out, laid siege to the city. On July the 15th, 1099, they broke through the walls. What followed was a massacre. The Crusaders killed a large number of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Medieval accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe scenes of extraordinary violence. Now, the often quoted claim that the streets ran ankle-deep or even knee-deep in blood is almost certainly a rhetorical exaggeration. As the historian Thomas Madden has noted, the amount of blood required to fill the streets to even a few inches would require far more people than actually lived in the city. But the reality was bad enough. Thousands of people were killed, mosques were desecrated, and the great synagogue was reportedly set on fire with people still inside it. It was a war crime by any standard, ancient or modern. And yet, even in this darkest moment, the story is more complicated than it first appears. Medieval warfare, in general, was extraordinarily brutal. The sack of a city that had resisted siege was considered customary in both Christian and Muslim military tradition. This does not excuse what happened, but it does place it in a context that is missing from most popular accounts, which tend to present the fall of Jerusalem as uniquely savage, as though Muslim armies of the period did not commit similar atrocities, which they absolutely did. The fall of Jerusalem led to the establishment of the Crusader states, a string of Christian territories along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These states would survive for nearly 2 centuries, a constant source of tension, warfare, and occasionally productive cultural exchange between the Christian and Muslim worlds. But here's a crucial point that almost never makes it into the popular narrative. The Crusader states were not colonies. They had no mother country. They were independent political entities, governed by their own laws and their own rulers. The European Catholic population in these states was always a tiny minority, easily less than 10% of the total population. The overwhelming majority of the inhabitants were Muslims, along with significant communities of Eastern Christians, Jews, and others. The Crusader states depended on these populations for their economic survival, and in many cases, everyday life involved a degree of coexistence and mutual accommodation that would surprise people who think of the Crusades as nothing but relentless conflict. This is one of the biggest things that historians get wrong, or at least that the popular understanding of the Crusades gets wrong. The colonial framework, the idea that the Crusades were medieval proto-imperialism, is an anachronism. It was invented in the 18th and 19th centuries by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Hume, and Gibbon, who projected their own era's experience with colonialism back onto the medieval period. It was then reinforced in the 20th century by both Arab nationalists and Western progressives, who found the analogy politically useful. But the analogy does not hold up under scrutiny. Crusading was almost never profitable. Modern scholarship, particularly the work of Jonathan Riley Smith, has shown that Crusaders typically impoverished themselves and their families to fund their expeditions. The costs were staggering, often 5 to 6 times a knight's annual income. They had to mortgage their lands, sell their possessions, and borrow heavily just to get to the Holy Land. Whatever booty they might capture was almost always dwarfed by their expenses. The vast majority of Crusaders had no intention of settling permanently in the East. They fulfilled their vows and went home as soon as they could. And here is something else that gets overlooked. The Muslim world, for centuries after the Crusades, did not particularly care about them. This might seem surprising, given how central the Crusades are to modern political rhetoric in the Middle East. But the historical record is quite clear. For medieval Muslims, the Crusades were a relatively minor annoyance on the periphery of the Islamic world. The real threats were the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, which were vastly more destructive than anything the Crusaders ever did, and internal power struggles among rival Muslim dynasties. The idea that the Crusades were a defining trauma in the Muslim historical consciousness is largely a modern construction, one that emerged in the 19th century when European colonial powers were actually occupying Muslim lands. It was at that point that Muslim intellectuals began reaching back to the Crusades as a historical framework for understanding and resisting European imperialism. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all. History is not just about what happened. It is about who tells the story and why. The Crusades have been reimagined and repurposed by every generation to serve the political needs of the moment. In the 18th century, they were portrayed as barbaric follies by Enlightenment philosophers who wanted to discredit the Church. In the 19th century, they were romanticized as noble civilizing missions by European imperialists who wanted to justify their own colonial adventures. In the 20th and 21st centuries, they have been weaponized by both Western and Islamist political movements to construct narratives of perpetual conflict between Christianity and Islam. None of these versions is the whole truth. The truth is that the Crusades were a complex, multi-layered historical phenomenon, driven by a combination of genuine religious conviction, geopolitical crisis, economic desperation, social pressure, political calculation, and individual ambition. They produced moments of extraordinary heroism and moments of sickening cruelty. They brought cultures into contact in ways that were sometimes destructive and sometimes productive. They reshaped the political map of the Mediterranean world and left legacies that are still debated today. But if you take away one thing from the story, let it be this. The Crusades did not begin in 1095. They began 450 years earlier, when vast swaths of the Christian world were conquered by military force. The call to crusade was not an act of unprovoked aggression. It was a response, delayed, imperfect, and often horrifically executed, to centuries of territorial loss and existential threat. Understanding that context does not justify every action taken by every crusader. It does not excuse the massacres of Jews in the Rhineland or the bloodbath in Jerusalem, but it does change the story from a simple morality tale of Western aggression into something far more honest and far more human, a story of people responding to impossible pressures with imperfect choices, driven by a mix of faith, fear, ambition, and desperation that is, in the end, recognizably, uncomfortably, inescapably human. And maybe that's the version of history we need. Not the version that flatters one side or condemns the other, not the version that serves a modern political agenda, but the messy, complicated, morally ambiguous version that actually reflects how the world works. Because if there is one thing that the true origin of the Crusades teaches us, it is that when you erase context, when you simplify complexity, when you turn history into a weapon, you don't just distort the past. You make it impossible to understand the present. And on that note, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It makes a huge difference for this channel, and it helps me keep making these deep dive documentaries for you. If you enjoyed this one, I think you'll love the video I did on the fall of Constantinople. It picks up right where this story leaves off, and trust me, it is just as wild. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.